All right, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and as part of the Rankin Technical College AWD 1000 Web Development Technologies course, I've been going through a series of video presentations I've been creating based off of the Mozilla Developer Network Learn Web Development series. I'm in the JavaScript portion, and we're talking about asynchronous JavaScript, and we are in the middle of the promises section. And in the last section, I downloaded a copy of the template, added the source files, the coffee.jpg, the t.jpg, and the description.txt. And it says in our script, we'll first define a function that returns the promises we want to send to promises.all. And they said there's an easy way we could do it. We could have done something like this. And then when the promise is fulfilled, the values would contain a 3 response object, but we don't want to do it this way. As it says here, our code doesn't care when the fetch operations are done. Rather, what we want is the loaded data. All right, sorry about that. So let's continue on. All right, it says we don't want to do this. Our code doesn't care when the fetch operations are done. Instead, all we want are the loaded data, is the loaded data. This means we want to run the promise all block when we get back usable blobs representing images and or a usable text string. We can write a function that does this. It says add the following inside of your script element. I don't think I've done this, but I'm not sure. So I finished this yesterday. I was working on this yesterday. So okay, so it says there fetch and decode. And it looks like I have done that. Okay, it says this looks a bit complex, so let's run through it step by step. And I think we did this yesterday, but the review isn't going to hurt. First of all, we define the function, fetch and decode. We pass it a URL, and we pass it a string that's going to basically say the MIME type or the type of resource, I guess, that we are expecting. Inside the body, as it says, we've got something similar to an earlier example. We call the fetch function to fetch the resource specified at that URL. Okay. Then we've got some chaining that's going to go on here. So dot then, we check the response. If for some reason the response didn't work, now remember, we talked about this before, that we could end up with wherever that was. If we came back with an error status, HTTP error status, like a 404 not found or whatever, we're going to throw that. If it doesn't do that, it didn't come back with an error. So if it's a blob, we want to return blob. All right. Otherwise, if it's text, we want to return text. Now notice there's a catch. What if it's not a blob, and what if it's not text? What if it's some kind of other kind of file? Then it's just going to say there's been a problem with your fetch operation. All right, and that's where I pretty much ended up last time. So it says, add the following inside of the callback. Here we use some fairly simple sync code to store the results in separate variables, creating URLs from the blobs, then display the images and the text on the page. So save and refresh, and you should see your components are all loaded, albeit not in an attractive way. All right, let's look at the see it live here. So there it is. So there was our coffee JPEG, there was our tea JPEG, and there was our text. All right. And let's see if I can, I don't want to waste too much time on this. So, let me jump back into their source code. And let me replace my fetch and decode, basically my script with their script. Now, remember, when I've been doing this, I've been getting CORS errors, and there's probably a pretty good chance I will in here again, but we'll check. So this is everything within my script tags. It's all in there now. Save. And again, this was in our, was it the request animation? Because if it is, we're getting nothing. Yes, I have saved, and I'm not getting anything. All right, so if you do run their program, it works. This is a problem that we're going to have on certain things that we try to do in here. All right. All right, it says if you get stuck, you can compare your version with ours to see what it was meant like, see it live, and that's what I just did. If you were improving this code, you might want to loop through a list of items displaying, fetching, and decoding each one, and then loop through the results inside the promise, all running a different function to display each one depending on the type of code it was. This would make it work for any number of items, not just 3. And again, we talked about that before. That would be a way of cleaning it up. Also, you could determine what type of file was being fetched explicitly. You could check the content type, HTTP header of the response to find that out. All right. Then as we finish this up, and we're not too far into this, it says running some final code after a promise fulfills or rejects. And as mentioned here, there will be cases where you want to run a final block of code after a promise completes, regardless of whether it worked or whether it did not work. Now, that's similar to a finally block that you've got in the try-catch statement. And again, just to give you a primer, so to speak, we will be actually going back to try-catch when we talk about the async await in the next lesson. All right. So it says previously you'd have to include the same code in both the then and the catch. So notice that and that. In more modern browsers, the .finally method is available, which can be changed. So it works very similar to the try-catch finally. In other words, if this succeeds, you skip this, but you do that anyway. If this fails, you do this, but you do that anyway. All right? So it says, for a real example, look at their demo. Now, I'm not sure exactly what's different from there, but let's see if we can find out. They added a finally at the end that said console.log that this had finished. So let's double check and see whether or not that actually worked. All right. And we come down and inspect. You can see, all right, we've got the attempt finished, this finished, and this finished. What did I do here? So fetch attempt for URL finish. So it did run for all 3. As it says, it simply logs a simple message to the console to let you know what happened. All right. The good news is that in a way you've already built your own promises. When we've changed multiple promises together with then blocks or otherwise combine them, you're already making your own custom async promise-based functions. It says take the fetch and decode from the previous example. Combining different promise-based APIs together to create custom functionality is by far the most common way that you'll do custom things with promises. And again, it shows why you would even do something like that. There is another way, however. It is possible, as mentioned here, to build your own promises using the promise constructor. Typically, you'd want to do this when you've got code based on an old school asynchronous API that is not promise-based. but you still want to act as though it is. As mentioned, this comes in handy when you're using an existing older project code library or framework, along with modern promise-based code. So let's have a look at the simple example to get you started. Here we wrap a set timeout, all right, with a promise. This runs after 2 seconds, and then it should say success, all right? Resolve and reject are functions that you can call to fulfill or reject a newly created promise. In this one, it's the resolve, and we're doing nothing with the reject. So as mentioned, when you call this promise, you can chain a then block to the end of it. So you notice the difference. The above example is not very flexible. Well, again, okay, it's not very flexible, but again, this is meant to work with old school types of things, and it's probably not going to run as crisply and as cleanly as newer promise technology would. We can create a promise that rejects using the reject method, just like resolve. It takes a single value, but in this case, it is the reason to reject. All right, so notice in this case, it says we're going to replace from the existing example. Well, here it says if there was no message, or if the type of message was not a string, you're going to reject. Or if there's no interval, or the type of interval was non-numeric, you're going to reject. But notice you're rejecting for 2 different things. You're coming up with 2 different reasons. So if you get down to this else down here, it worked, is what they're saying. So as mentioned here, we are passing 2 arguments into a custom function, a message to do something with, and a time interval to pass before doing whatever it is. Inside the promise constructor, we do our checks. First of all, we check to see if the message is appropriate for being altered. If it is an empty string or not a string at all, we reject it. All right. Next, we check to see if the interval was an appropriate time value. It can't be negative and it can't be non-numeric. If it's either one of those is the case, we reject with a different error message. Finally, if we get down to the else, well, then it was a string and it was a numeric value, positive, that we put in. So we resolve the promise. Okay. And as it says, since the timeout promise function returns a promise, we can chain then, catch, etc. onto it to make use of the functionality. All right. So finally, it says the above example was kept deliberately simple. Well, again, as you're first starting out with this, I don't believe that that's simplistic at all. All right. One example we'd like to invite you to study to show a useful async application of promises, Jake Archibald's IDB library, which takes the index DB API, an old-style callback function for storing and retrieving data on the client side, and allows you to use it with promises. Okay, so that's one you might want to check out. All right, so to conclude, as it says, promises are a good way to build asynchronous applications when we don't know the return value of the function or how long it'll take to return. Promises work with the latest versions of all modern browsers, and the only place where promise support will be a problem is Opera Mini, IE 11, and earlier IE versions. We didn't touch on all the promise features, but again, there's the MDN promise page, and there's a lot of other stuff that's in here too. All right. In the next thing that we'll talk about, again, you got to look at the progression of this. We kind of went from callbacks to promises, and now we're going to talk about async and await. When the way I look at that, it's kind of a wrapper, WRAPPER, for the use of promises. And we'll talk about that in just a couple minutes.